From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
We are very mindful of Ethiopia's history, the hardships that this country's gone through. It has been relatively recently in which the Constitution that was formed and the elections put forward a democratically elected government.
Months after Ethiopia's ruling party won 100% of the seats in parliament, President Obama faces criticism for describing Ethiopia as a democratically elected government. We'll speak with Professor Horace Campbell about Obama's historic African trip. Then we'll hear from Swedish journalist who was jailed in Ethiopia on terrorism charges for over a year.
We went and we did a story which was supposed to be about oil, but it turned out to be about ink, about press freedom, and we slept on the concrete floor in a prison with 8,000 inmates, and we didn't go home the next day. We stayed and we stayed and we stayed and we stayed for 438 days.
And as over 25,000 protest in Honduras calling for the nation's president to resign, we'll speak with former President Manuel Zelaya about the growing protests and about Hillary Clinton's role in the 2009 coup that ousted him from power.
Pero por otro lado, estaban negociando.
On the one hand, they condemned the coup, but on the other hand, they were negotiating with the leaders of the coup. And Secretary Clinton lent herself to that, maintaining that ambiguity of U.S. policy toward Honduras, which has resulted in a process of distrust and instability of Latin American governments in relation to U.S. foreign policies.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Yemen, the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition launched a new wave of airstrikes Monday, despite the 5-day humanitarian truce that went into effect Sunday night. Meanwhile, Human Rights Watch has said Friday's Saudi-led bombings of the western port city of Mocha, which killed at least 120 people, appear to be a war crime. The continued fighting comes as Oxfam warns Yemen is facing, quote, the highest ever recorded number of people living in hunger. In news from Libya, Muammar Gaddafi's son and 8 others have been sentenced to death for committing war crimes during the crackdown against the 2011 revolution, which ultimately toppled the Gaddafi regime. The former prime minister and head of intelligence are also facing the death penalty. In news from Turkey, the police have detained more than 1,000 people in the ongoing crackdown on suspected militants from the self-proclaimed Islamic State, as well as members of the dissident Kurdish Workers' Party known as the PKK. Meanwhile, at an emergency meeting in Brussels today, NATO offered support for Turkey's escalating military actions, which include airstrikes against ISIL in Syria and attacks on PKK camps in northern Iraq. The New York Times editorial board has called Turkey's assault on PKK camps a, quote, dangerous development that will create even more turmoil in the region. In Germany, an explosion in Dresden struck the car of a leftist politician who's been advocating for refugees. The explosion comes one day after Dresden residents smashed windows in a hotel that's being converted into refugee housing. Asylum applications to Germany are expected to double this year as hundreds of thousands of refugees flee Syria, Iraq, and the Balkans. No one was hurt in Monday's explosion. The Boy Scouts of America has ended its nationwide ban on gay adult leaders. The move follows the Boy Scouts' decision to open its ranks to gay scouts 2 years ago. Monday's policy shift, which takes effect immediately, still permits local church-sponsored troops to discriminate against gay leaders. A federal judge has issued a harsh condemnation of the mass detention of immigrant women and children, calling it deplorable. The ruling by U.S. District Judge Daligi gives the Obama administration 90 days to either release the more than 2,000 women and children being held in 2 Texas facilities or to show just cause to continue holding them. Immigration lawyers say the ruling has already had a groundbreaking impact as Texas judges have started ordering women and children's release without bond. In the latest news from Waller County, Texas, a team of outside lawyers will be assisting in the investigation of the death of Sandra Bland, who was found dead in a jail cell 2 weeks ago. Texas State Trooper Brian Encinia forcibly removed Bland from her car after she objected to putting out her cigarette when he pulled her over for allegedly failing to signal a lane change. Authorities say Sandra Bland killed herself in jail, a claim her family disputes. The lawyers will have access to evidence, the ability to subpoena witnesses, and the power to recommend criminal charges to Waller County District Attorney Elton Mathis. If Mathis fails to take up any possible recommended charges, the committee of lawyers can instead present their recommendations to a grand jury. So far, 2 lawyers have been appointed to the panel. Both are African American. Bree Newsom, the African-American woman who scaled the flagpole and removed the Confederate flag from the South Carolina state capitol grounds after the shooting of 9 African-American churchgoers in Charleston, has been scheduled for a trial in November. Newsom and Jimmy Tyson, the white activist who helped her, have been charged with defacing state property, which can carry 3 years in prison and a $5,000 fine. They had their first appearance in court Monday, and a trial date was set, even though South Carolina lawmakers have voted the flag down and it no longer flies on the grounds of the state capitol. To see our hour with Jimmy Tyson and Bree Newsom, you can go to democracynow.org. The U.S. State Department has upgraded Malaysia's human trafficking rating, despite protests from human rights groups and lawmakers who say the step was taken to ease passage of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Pact. Monday's announcement came 1 day before the start of a fresh round of TPP talks in Hawaii. Malaysia, one of 12 countries in the secretive trade pact, was previously given the worst trafficking record, but a new measure bars the United States from negotiating trade deals with the worst-ranked countries. In a response to a reporter's question, Undersecretary of State Sarah Sewell denied the TPP influenced Malaysia's rating.
This is something that's been questioned by rights groups and quite a large numbers of members of Congress. Did that come into play at all?
No. The annual TIP report reflects the State Department's assessment of foreign government efforts during the reporting period to comply with the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking in persons established under U.S. law, under the TVPA. And those standards, as I articulated, are quite well spelled out in the legislation. And those are the standards that are applied based on the factual reporting that is gathered during the course of the year.
The United States also upgraded the human trafficking rating of Cuba. Amnesty International says Mexico is facing a crisis of enforced disappearances. The statement came after the Associated Press reported authorities have found at least 60 mass graves with 129 bodies in the southern state of Iguala since the disappearance of 43 students there 10 months ago. Anti-choice hackers have reportedly released Planned Parenthood's website databases and employee email addresses in a targeted attack. The hack comes after anti-choice activists release edited videos that appear to show Planned Parenthood doctors discussing the practice of sharing fetal tissue with researchers. In an interview on ABC's This Week, Planned Parenthood President Cecile Richards said the donations are never for profit and any charges cover only the cost of transmission to researchers.
Doctors repeatedly said, it's all been edited out, Planned Parenthood does not at all profit from fetal tissue donation, which is an important element of healthcare research in this country. I think what's not told is that, of course, these are highly selectively edited. The folks behind this, in fact, are part of the most militant wing of the anti-abortion movement that has been behind, the bombing of clinics, the murder of doctors in their homes and in their churches. And that's what actually needs to be looked at.
Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump, who called Mexican immigrants rapists, has been accused of rape in the past by his ex-wife. The Daily Beast reports Ivana Trump made the accusation in a 1989 deposition and later softened her language, saying she felt violated during an encounter where Trump reportedly held back her arms, pulled out fistfuls of her hair. The assault was described in the 1993 book Lost Tycoon. Michael Cohen, an attorney at the Trump Organization, incorrectly told the Daily Beast, quote, "You cannot rape your spouse," and then threatened the outlet, saying, quote, "What I'm going to do to you is going to be effing disgusting." He actually used the word. Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton has outlined her plan to address climate change, calling for a 7-fold increase in solar panels and for a third of the nation's electricity to be produced by renewable sources by 2027. The announcement comes after the Huffington Post revealed earlier this month nearly all the lobbyists bundling contributions for Clinton have worked for the fossil fuel industry. And the U.S. Olympic Committee has dropped Boston as its proposed bid city to host the 2024 Olympics following mass resistance by city residents. Amidst protests over the high cost to taxpayers and the mass displacement seen in other Olympic host cities, the Olympic Committee acknowledged in a statement, quote, "We have not been able to get a majority of the citizens of Boston to support hosting the 2024 Olympics." And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We turn now to President Obama's historic trip to Africa, where he's set to become the first U.S. president to address the African Union. On Monday, Obama made history by becoming the first sitting U.S. president to visit Ethiopia, but he is facing criticism after twice describing Ethiopia as a democratically elected government, despite a recent parliamentary election when Ethiopia's ruling party won 100% of the country's 547 parliament seats. Obama made the comment Monday during a news conference in Addis Ababa alongside Ethiopian Prime Minister Hailemariam Desalegn.
We are very mindful of Ethiopia's history, the hardships that this country's gone through. It has been relatively recently in which the Constitution that was formed and the elections put forward a democratically elected government. As I indicated when I was in Kenya, there's still more work to do. And I think the Prime Minister is the first to acknowledge that there's more work to do.
Human rights groups widely criticized the recent Ethiopian parliamentary elections as a sham. In a recent report, Human Rights Watch said, quote, authorities use arbitrary arrests and politically motivated prosecutions to silence journalists, bloggers, protesters, and perceived supporters of opposition political parties. During Monday's press conference, Obama also praised Ethiopia's fight against the Somali-based militant group al-Shabaab.
Our security cooperation is pushing back against violent extremism. Ethiopia faces serious threats, and its contribution to the African Union mission in Somalia have reduced areas under al-Shabaab control. But as the Prime Minister noted, yesterday's bombing in Mogadishu reminds us that terrorist groups like al-Shabaab offer nothing but death and destruction and have to be stopped. We've got more work to do. This past week, Ethiopian troops have helped retake 2 major al-Shabaab strongholds. We have to now keep the pressure on.
To talk more about the significance of President Obama's visit, we go to Syracuse to speak with Horace Campbell, professor of African-American Studies and Political Science at Syracuse University. He's written extensively on African politics. His new piece for Counterpunch is called Obama in Africa. Overall, Professor Campbell, can you start off by talking about the significance of President Obama's Africa trip, the first time a U.S. sitting president has gone to Ethiopia, the first time a U.S. sitting president has gone to Kenya, which also happens to be his father's birthplace, and the first time a U.S. president is addressing the African Union?
Well, thank you, Amy, and thank you for having us on the program. I think this was a liberating trip for President Obama, and from the news coverage of his trip to Kenya, one could see that this was truly liberating for him. He called himself an African-American for the first time. I heard him say he called himself a Kenyan-American. He was dancing, and there was genuine joy that he was having on this trip. But one could see all around that President Obama was compromised. He was compromised because of the footprints of the United States in Eastern Africa, especially in Kenya and Ethiopia and Somalia, in this mission that the United States has been on since 2001, which is what they call counterterrorism. And this counterterrorism operation that the United States has been involved with, that was called the War on Terror, has led to the militarization of Eastern Africa, with the epicenter of this war against the peoples of Somalia, and now the peoples of Kenya have been brought into this war. And one of the things that the people of Kenya have called for is for complete demilitarization of this region. Yesterday, on Sunday morning, when President Obama met members of the opposition, they called for the withdrawal of Kenyan troops from Somalia. And I think this is something that the left in this country should agree on, that in every aspect of the relationship with the United States and the governments of Kenya, Uganda, Somalia, Ethiopia, and South Sudan, we have the United States having the history of its military involvement and the history of counterterrorism, unleashing forces that cannot be controlled. So yesterday morning, when Barack Obama sat down with the African Union, with the Troika, Norway, United States, and Britain, and with IGAD, all of the leaders of IGAD that were sitting at the table with Obama, the foreign minister of Sudan, the prime minister of Ethiopia, the president of Uganda, and the president of Kenya, all have been involved in this militarization of the region, and we need conscious, clear guidelines and pathways how we're going to bring peace to this region. And I'm glad you pointed out in the lead up to this segment about the compromise of the US government with the Ethiopian leadership. The Ethiopian leadership is particularly despicable. It is a leadership that has violated the rights of the millions of Ethiopian peoples. Nearly 1 million Ethiopian women are sold or are sent as domestic slaves to Saudi Arabia, and the relationship of the Kenyan government to the majority of the relationship of the Ethiopian government to the majority of the people is one of unbridled repression. So Obama was compromised by his relationship with those leaders of Kenya, Ethiopia, Uganda, and the Sudan.
On Monday, President Obama talked about the ongoing conflict in South Sudan.
Ethiopia has also been a key partner as we seek to resolve the ongoing crisis in South Sudan. Later today, the Prime Minister and I will meet with leaders from across the region to discuss ways we can encourage the government and opposition in South Sudan to end the violence and move toward a peace agreement. The situation is deteriorating. The humanitarian situation is worsening. The possibilities of renewed conflict in a region that has been torn by conflict for so long and has resulted in so many deaths is something that requires urgent attention from all of us, including the international community.
The Ethiopian Prime Minister, Haile Mariam Desalegn, also addressed the situation in South Sudan.
As regards to South Sudan, I cannot agree more with the President. But we should also recognize that this process has taken a long negotiation period. On the other hand, the people are suffering on the ground, and we cannot let this go unchecked. And I think the meeting which we are making this afternoon has a strong signal and message that has to be passed to the parties in South Sudan to see that their is first.
That's Ethiopian Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn. Professor Horace Campbell, your response.
Here we have a government that blocked the report of the African Union Commission for Inquiry into the situation in South Sudan. One of the tragedies of the South Sudan situation has been the way in which the international organizations, NGO, and people around Barack Obama himself, like Gail Smith, people from the Enough Project, Susan Rice, have been involved in this disaster from the beginning. And so what one needs is to step back from the hype about how to go forward and look concretely at the role of the African Union and the deliberations of the African Union Commission of Inquiry into the South Sudan situation. This report that was done last year by the African Union was supposed to be tabled at the African Union Summit in June in South Africa. The Ethiopians blocked the report. It was only last week, Friday, on the 24th, before the meeting of the Obama with IGAD that the report was presented to the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, and it was not presented to the heads of state as it was supposed to be. It was presented to the foreign ministers, downgrading the importance of this report, which has far-reaching recommendations about how to demilitarize South Sudan and the support of the United Nations, the NGOs, and the Troika for the military factions, that they need a transition government in South Sudan, they need at least 5 years of peace, and that we should not have this false dichotomy between sanctions and military intervention by the African Union. Of all the persons sitting at the table yesterday with Obama, the only person who was not compromised was the head of the African Union, Nkosazana Zuma. We need to get this Commission of Inquiry, the information out there, debated at great length in Africa, because it comprised of the best brains in Africa. Even a member of the leading left force in East Africa was a member of this Commission of Inquiry. So we need to have a clear roadmap of how to demilitarize the situation in South Sudan. Unfortunately, President Obama, his advisors like Gail Smith and Susan Rice will not be in a position to give the kind of advice that can lead to the demilitarization of the situation in South Sudan.
Professor Campbell, we have less than a minute, but can you compare the U.S. presence in Africa with China's presence?
I think it's a very difficult to compare, because the case of the Chinese are bringing real, concrete support for infrastructure development. And the Chinese have the capacity at the financial level to invest in infrastructure. What the United States is invested in, and the United States and the West has the upper hand, is at the cultural and ideological level, at the level of ideas about how to organize society, at the level of language, and most importantly, the role of the church, the role of religion. The Chinese can never compete at the cultural level with the investment of the Western religious institutions, especially the born-again religious forces. And these born-again religious forces are the forces that are spewing hate around Africa and spewing hatred for same-gender loving persons. So what one needs is for the progressive forces in the United States to be able to push an agenda so that the United States and China and the progressive forces can work for the rights of women, the rights of youth, and for the rights of what Obama said he was working for, entrepreneurs. That this is not for the entrepreneurs of private equity, but for the ordinary business persons in Africa who want to uplift the standard of living of the African people.
Horace Campbell, I want to thank you for being with us, Professor of African American Studies and Political Science at Syracuse University. We will link to your new piece at Counterpunch, headlined Obama in Africa. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we speak with a journalist who was recently released from an Ethiopian jail and wrote a book, 438 Days, How Our Quest to Expose the Dirty Oil Business in the Horn of Africa Got Us Tortured, Sentenced as Terrorists, and Put Away in Ethiopia's Most Infamous Prisons. Stay with us. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. While President Obama visited Ethiopia Monday, he made a passing reference to press freedom, calling on the Ethiopian government to, quote, open additional space for journalists, for media, for opposition voices. Well, the Committee to Protect Journalists has described Ethiopia as one of the leading jailers of journalists on the continent. At least 11 journalists and bloggers are currently in prison. 6 others were released just before Obama's visit. Today, we turn to the remarkable story of 2 Swedish journalists who traveled to Ethiopia in 2011 to report on the actions of the Swedish oil company Lundin Oil in the Ogaden region, where there's been a fight for independence since the 70s. Lundin Oil is well known in Sweden, in part because one of its past board members is Carl Bildt, Sweden's former prime minister and foreign secretary. 5 days after crossing the border from Somalia to Ethiopia, the journalists, Schibbye and Johan Persson, were shot and captured by the Ethiopian army. They ended up spending over a year in prison, which they chronicle in their book, 438 Days, How Our Quest to Expose the Dirty Oil Business in the Horn of Africa Got Us Tortured, Sentenced as Terrorists, and Put Away in Ethiopia's Most Infamous Prison. I had a chance to interview Schibbye last year in Sweden at the Almedalen Political Festival in Visby, an island off of Sweden. I asked him to describe what happened to him.
Well, the short version is I was jailed for doing my job as a journalist in a country where journalism is criminalized. The longer version goes that me and the photographer, Johan Persson, were supposed to investigate a Swedish oil company active in the Ogaden region. And in this oil company, the Swedish foreign minister had been on the board. And they were exploring oil in a region which is war-torn, in a region where refugees are fleeing in numbers, and in a region where there are reports of gross human rights violations. So there were two sides to this story. The oil company would say that, well, exploring oil will benefit the region. The refugees were saying, no, the oil companies make the situation worse. And we didn't want to do on one hand, on the other hand, in the end time will tell story. We wanted to see for ourselves what is true or not. So, and kind of use our feet more than Google, and wanted to go into this region and see how was the situation there for the civilian population.
Especially for an American audience, I don't think the conflict in Ethiopia is very well known. Can you explain what the Ogaden region is?
The Ogaden region is in the east of Ethiopia, and it's a region inhabited by ethnical Somalis. So it has long time been debated and fought over between Somalia and Ethiopia, and currently the region is within the borders of Ethiopia. But the inhabitants feel colonized. They feel they are misrepresented within the Ethiopian political system. So there is a guerrilla movement fighting for independence, attacking foreign oil companies. But the problem is also that the region is closed. Ethiopia doesn't allow any journalists to enter. The UN are not allowed to enter. The Red Cross has been kicked out. Doctors Without Borders have been kicked out. So it's an area which is kind of a white area on the map. Few reports get out of what is really happening there. So that's why it was crucial as a journalist to go there and give people living in this area a voice and see what they have to say about oil exploration and about foreign companies coming together with the Ethiopian military to explore oil.
Explain further, Martin, who the oil company was and its connection to the current foreign minister, Carl Bildt of Sweden.
Well, Lundin Petroleum is the name of the big company, and they had a daughter company called Africa Oil, and Carl Bildt has been on the board of Lundin Petroleum. So that was the connection. At the time, 2011, when we went to do this story, he was no longer on the board.
Why was he on the board of Lundin, of this oil company?
Well, after many people believe that he had left politics. He went into business and he became a board member. I think you'll have to ask him about that. It's a very special company, and it's known for kind of being non-ethical. They did business with South Africa during apartheid. They were kicked out of Congo by the UN. They were doing business with Assad's Syria. So it's an oil company that goes to areas where no other oil companies enters. So it's a very special company to be in the board of.
Talk about what happened to you.
So basically what Ethiopia did when they arrested me and Johan in the Ogaden region was to violate every international rule there is. They didn't take us to an embassy. They didn't give us medical care for our gun wounds. We were both shot during the arrest. We were kept in the desert, and instead they brought in some Steven Spielberg figure who turned out to be the vice president of the region, who made a mockumentary about what happened when we were arrested. They brought in fake rebels who they gave guns, and it was a total surreal episode where we under gunpoint had to participate in the movie that was supposed to be shown on the Ethiopian state television and also used in court to sentence us for support of terrorism.
Wait, let's go back a step.
Yeah.
Describe how you were arrested, how you were captured, how you came into the country, and what happened next.
Well, we entered into the region with a smuggler from Somalia, and we met up with a guerrilla group that were supposed to be our guides and take us to the oil fields so that we could interview civilians there. And the first days and nights when we walk in the Ogaden desert are quite airy. We pass refugees who are fleeing on their way to the refugee camps in Kenya. We pass surrendered huts where people have lived until recently. We pass people who have been subjected to torture from the Ethiopian military. And we feel that this is really, the conflict level here is very, very high. There's really a story to tell. And but after 3 days of walking, we are ambushed by the Ethiopian military, and we are immediately shot. I'm shot through the shoulder, and the photographer is shot through his arm. So we have no other option but to raise our hands in the sky and shout, media, media, international press, and then we are arrested. And at that point, we believe that we would be kicked out, because that happened to New York Times when they were arrested in Ogaden. It has happened to several other journalists who have been arrested in this area. But Ethiopia wants to make an example and to scare off other foreign journalists from entering the region, and also, and I think most importantly, send a message to their own journalists. Look what we can do to these two Swedish guys. Imagine what we can do to you. So they wanted to inflict fear in the Ethiopian society. So then we are led through this 4 or 5 horrible days in the desert when they fabricate evidence against us under gunpoint. And to make us cooperate, they also arrange a mock execution, which is arranged by the vice president in the region, and he's a member of the Ethiopian parliament. He arranges a mock execution where we are forced to walk towards the horizon, and there is a firing squad behind us, and I'm told to stop, to turn around, and he says, this is your last chance. Admit that you are cooperating with the terrorists or you will be shot. And then they fire in the bush next to me, and from the sound I kind of fall down, and then I get up and I brush the dust off, and then a film camera comes up and another interrogation takes place. So it was really a violation of all the legal protocols that you could think of.
Did you say what they wanted you to say?
No, they wanted us to basically say that we were there to support the rebels. No, we never said that. We said that we are Swedish journalists and we are here to do our job. But just being there, just talking to this group was enough, according to the Ethiopian terrorism law, to sentence us. And it was very clear when we were brought to the federal police station and we found out who was in the neighboring cell, who was in the cell to the left or to the right and in front of us. It was no criminals. There were young journalists, activists, bloggers, politicians, different community leaders, and then we really could feel that we had ended up in something that was just bigger, that was much bigger than 2 Swedish journalists just violating some visa.
This mockumentary, as you call it, this fake documentary, when they were filming you and said they would shoot you if you didn't say you were working with terrorists, did you then say, I am working with terrorists?
No.
You wouldn't say it?
No.
So what did they do with this film?
They made a long mockumentary about it, and first of all they showed it in court, and they said that the people on this film are the people that you walked with, which they were not. All the rebels we walked with ran away, so they were kind of fake rebels. And they also sentenced these fake rebels to 17 years in prison. So it was basically used as a fabricated evidence in court, and it was also used on the Ethiopian state television to kind of show Ethiopia that these were 2 Swedish terrorists who had entered their country to support terrorism.
What happened to you in prison?
I mean, the first month before we were charged were the most difficult, when we were kept in solitary confinement and we were interrogated and threatened with the death sentence or with life in prison, and it was kind of you had to win a battle against yourself every day, and kind of take a teaspoon of cement every morning, and just to try and think that Well, they may take my physical freedom, they may take my shoelaces, even my shoes, my belt, my pen and paper, but there's one thing they can't take from me, and that is to decide, who I am. And I am a journalist, so it's just another day at the office. I try to live in that bubble and kind of, okay, how big is this cell? How would I describe this cell in my future writing, and try to start communicating with the other prisoners and try to never give up that core thing within you, who you are. They could never take that from you, even though you were handcuffed and in a dark room. So by thinking as a journalist, I survived mentally and was able to communicate with the other jail journalists, the local journalists, and they gave me a lot of strength and kind of explained what was going on in Ethiopia. We have to remember that this was also 2011. The Arab Spring was raging in Egypt. You had Tunisia, you had Syria. Gaddafi hadn't fallen yet in Libya, and of course, a country which has 99.6% of the seats in the parliament, they would look to North Africa with fear, and decided to rather act than being acted upon. So we ended up in a major crackdown against free speech, and all of the local Ethiopian journalists and politicians that were arrested at this time, they are still in jail. They are still in the prison.
Were you able to communicate with your cameraman?
Yes.
During the time you were in solitary?
No.
So you had no idea what was happening to him?
No, and they tried to, of course, play us against each other.
You were both shot, so you're both dealing with your injuries.
Yes. And we were denied also proper medical care. We had a way to communicate after a while, and while knocking on the door through a certain kind of Swedish way of knocking, I could understand that he was there and that he was alive.
What's the Swedish way of knocking?
I don't know, it was something like this. And then he would answer in the same way, and I would know that, he's alive. I'm not alone.
The video that was made to falsely implicate you, that was shown in Sweden as well?
Yes.
What was the response here?
I think in the beginning it was a lot of confusion. Journalists kind of quoted, they had this one hand on the other hand perspective. So they would kind of see the Minister of Information in Ethiopia as a reliable source in the beginning. After a while, these things changed, and they definitely changed when one of the people responsible of making this video, his name is Abdullahi Hussein, he felt that this is wrong.
Who was he working for?
He was working for the president of the region and for the vice president, and he was head of the communications department. He decided to become a whistleblower. So he took the original film from us in the desert, together with a lot of other material which shows atrocities, torture, the Ethiopian military committing atrocities in the region. And he left, with risking his life, left everything and went to Kenya and managed to get in contact with a journalist at the Swedish television. So after our release, the whole kind of material was shown, and when the whole material was shown, you could see how everything was rigged. Can you talk, Martin, about when you learned you were going to be freed and what that release was like for you? We were called up in the loudspeaker, and the Swedish ambassador was there to meet us and to take us out of prison, and there was just one hurdle left, and that was that Ethiopian state television wanted us to make an interview. The interview they didn't succeed in doing in the desert, and basically we could have said no to that and go back and take our 11 years, and we wouldn't survive that, or we would say to the Ethiopian journalist that we apologizes and accepted guilt, and then they checked the interview at their information department, and then we were released and sent back to Sweden. But I'm free. I'm free from the prison, but I'm I will never be free from the memories. I'm not free from the sounds. It doesn't go a day that I don't think of all the colleagues who were there. I mean, especially the sounds, the screams, when people, kind of the first screams you really remember, because those were always the worst, and then eventually the abused prisoner was always silent, but the first scream before the first stroke hit, those screams you never forget, and those will haunt me for the rest of my life and be a part of me. But it also, I think this experience makes me a better journalist. I mean, usually you go and you do a story and then you go to a hotel and you take a beer and that's it. Now we went and we did a story which was supposed to be about oil, but it turned out to be about ink, about press freedom, and we slept on the concrete floor in a prison with 8,000 inmates, and we didn't go home the next day. We stayed and we stayed and we stayed and we stayed for 438 days, and of course we were always somehow tourists in that environment. We had our embassy, we had our Swedish passports, but still I went from just being someone who's standing and looking at something, and also I mean, participating in something, and those experiences and really seeing the conditions of those prisoners and talking to them and sharing life stories with them, that makes me a better journalist.
And here at Ogaden, we have passed the foreign minister, Carl Bildt, several times, just walking down the street. Since you were freed, have you spent time with the foreign minister?
I met him briefly, and we have been. Our message to him has been to learn the name of the jailed that are still in the Kaliti prison, and to work for their release. I mean, especially Reut Alem, Wubshetai, Skindenega, and many others colleagues who are still there. We have been encouraging him to raise that issue.
And they were doing what as journalists? What were they investigating?
Their crime is just writing about their reality. It doesn't take an investigative report to get you in jail in Ethiopia. It just takes some criticism of the government. And especially one of them, Reut Alem, she's suffering from cancer in one of her breasts in the prison. And I remember at one point I was able to read a small note that she sent us, and she wrote that her name was Reut Alem. She wrote why she became a journalist, that she wanted to write about the injustice she saw in Ethiopia, and that decision had led her to prison. And she said that, please, Martin, if you are released before me, tell the world I'm a journalist, I'm not a terrorist. And I mean, doing that is kind of the only way to live with this experience. I mean, to try and put the searchlight on that prison and on Ethiopia and on the colleagues that are still there and still suffering just for doing their job. I mean, their only crime is courage, and I'm proud that there are such colleagues in the world who's prepared to pay the highest price for this profession.
Swedish journalist Martin Schibbye. He and Johan Persson wrote about their jailing in Ethiopia in the book titled 438 Days, How Our Quest to Expose the Dirty Oil Business in the Horn of Africa Got Us Tortured, Sentenced as Terrorists, and Put Away in Ethiopia's most famous prison. I interviewed Martin last year in Sweden. Earlier this month, Reut Alem, the Ethiopian journalist Schibbye mentioned during the interview, was released from prison after 4 years in jail on terrorism charges. In an interview with the New York Times, she said about the Ethiopian government, quote, "They just want to pretend in front of Obama and the international community that they're democratic and trying to improve human rights conditions." Special thanks to Cassandra Lazaire and John Hamilton. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the ousted president of Honduras, Manuel Zelaya. Stay with us.
Mathematics, they forgot you're the land of the pharaohs. Plus you birthed us all, nobody can deny. Most of the men that said they loved you only robbed you blind. Swiss bank accounts, they hiding all your funds. Instead of education, they patiently give the children guns. So while I write you this letter, I need some clarity. People think that Africa's synonymous to charity. All the while
this is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. We turn now to Honduras, where as many as 25,000 people